The carriage wheel struck a stone in the road, and Eliza Hartwell nearly fell from her seat. She caught the edge of the wooden bench just in time, her knuckles white against the splintered wood. Outside the small window, the towers of Vane Manor rose out of the mist like something carved from ice. She had heard whispers about this place long before she arrived. The servants who worked there did not speak of the Duke with warmth. They spoke of him the way one might speak of a storm that could arrive without warning and destroy everything in its path. She stepped down from the carriage with her single trunk gripped in both hands. The gravel crunched beneath her worn boots. A cold wind cut across the courtyard, pulling at her cloak, and she pressed her lips together to keep her teeth from chattering. She could not afford to look weak. Not today, not ever, if she wanted to keep this position. Her family needed the money. That was the plain truth of it. Her father's business had collapsed months earlier, swallowed by debts that were not entirely his own fault, and the shame of it still clung to their name in the village. Eliza had taken the post at Vane Manor because there was no other choice left to her. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, or so she had told herself on the long journey north. A woman in a gray dress and a stiff white apron met her at the servants' entrance. Her face was lined with years of hard work, and her eyes moved over Eliza with quick, practiced judgment. "You must be the new girl," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Prentice, head housekeeper of this house. You will address me as such, and you will follow my instructions without question. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza said. Mrs. Prentice studied her a moment longer, as if trying to guess how long this one would last. "Come inside. There is much to learn, and little time to learn it." The interior of the manor was grander than anything Eliza had ever seen. Marble floors stretched beneath towering ceilings painted with scenes of clouds and gilded figures. Portraits lined the long hallway, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. She kept her gaze low, as she had been taught, though it was difficult not to stare. Mrs. Prentice led her through a maze of corridors, naming rooms and duties faster than Eliza could commit them to memory. The library, the east drawing room, the Duke's private study, which no servant was to enter unless summoned, the kitchens, where a red-faced cook barked orders at two younger girls polishing silver. "You will begin in the west wing," Mrs. Prentice said. "Dusting, polishing, tending the fires. Simple work. Do it well, and do it quietly. The Duke does not tolerate carelessness." "I understand," Eliza said. "See that you do." For the first hour, everything went as expected. Eliza moved from room to room with a cloth in hand, wiping down surfaces that already seemed to gleam. She kept her head down and her thoughts to herself, focusing on the rhythm of the work, the way her mother had once taught her to focus on stitching when her hands grew tired. It was in the long gallery, beneath a row of ancestral portraits, that everything changed. She was reaching to straighten a vase of white lilies on a marble pedestal, when her elbow caught the edge of a small porcelain figure resting nearby. It toppled before she could stop it, striking the floor and shattering into a dozen pieces. The sound echoed through the empty gallery like a gunshot. Eliza dropped to her knees immediately, gathering the broken pieces with trembling hands, her mind racing through the cost of what she had just destroyed. She did not hear the footsteps approaching, until a shadow fell across the floor in front of her. She looked up. The man standing over her was tall, dressed in a dark coat that fit him with severe precision. His face was handsome in a hard, unyielding way, his jaw set, his eyes the pale gray of a winter sky. She did not need to be told who he was. Every line of his posture spoke of command, of a man who expected the world to bend to his will. Duke Alaric Vane looked down at the broken porcelain, then at her. "That figure belonged to my grandmother," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that cut deeper than shouting ever could. It survived 2 wars and outlived 3 generations of this family. And now it lies in pieces on my floor. Eliza rose slowly to her feet, still holding the broken shards in her palm. "It was an accident, Your Grace. I take full responsibility." "Do you?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "And what exactly do you imagine that responsibility looks like? Do you intend to pay for it out of your wages? It would take you a decade to afford even a fraction of its worth." Something in his tone made her spine straighten. She had expected fear to rise in her chest, and it did. But beneath the fear was something else, something hotter. She had spent the last months of her life being spoken down to by creditors, by neighbors who once called her family friends, by anyone who sensed weakness and wished to press their advantage. She was tired of lowering her eyes. "I did not break it on purpose, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I have offered to take responsibility in whatever way you see fit. If you wish to shout at me further, I will stand here and listen." but I will not grovel for an accident, and I will not pretend to feel more shame than the situation warrants." The gallery went utterly silent. Somewhere behind her, she heard a sharp intake of breath, and she realized Mrs. Prentice had entered the hall and witnessed the entire exchange, her face pale with horror. The Duke did not move. He simply stared at Eliza, as if she were a puzzle he had not expected to encounter in his own home. No servant spoke to him this way. No one spoke to him this way. His household operated on the currency of fear, and fear alone, and this maid, barely a day into her employment, had looked him in the eye and refused to bow. "What is your name?" he said finally. "Eliza Hartwell, Your Grace." "Eliza Hartwell." He repeated it slowly, as though testing the shape of it in his mouth. "You are either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps I am simply tired of being neither," she said. For a moment, something flickered behind his cold gray eyes. It was gone before she could name it. He turned without another word and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the long gallery until they faded into silence. Mrs. Prentice rushed forward the instant he was gone, her face flushed with alarm. "Are you mad? Do you have any idea what you have just done? No one speaks to the Duke that way. No one." "I only spoke the truth," Eliza said, though her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed. "The truth will get you dismissed within the week," Mrs. Prentice said, gathering the broken porcelain from Eliza's palm. "Or worse. He has a temper, girl. A temper that has ruined men far more powerful than a housemaid. You must learn to hold your tongue in this house, or you will not last a month." Eliza said nothing, but inside, a quiet resolve had begun to take root. She had spent her whole life being told to make herself smaller, to swallow her words, to accept whatever treatment was handed to her, because she had no power to demand otherwise. She had come to this house desperate and afraid, and in the span of a single conversation, she had discovered that fear was not the only thing left inside her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks, each one supervised more closely than before. Word of the confrontation had already spread through the servants' quarters by the time she sat down for a hurried supper in the kitchen. The other maids glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity, as though she were already a ghost walking among them. "You truly spoke to him like that?" A young maid named Charlotte whispered across the table, her eyes wide. "I only told him the truth," Eliza said again. "No one tells the Duke the truth," Charlotte said. "Not since his father died, not since he became what he is now." "What is he now?" Charlotte glanced toward the door, lowering her voice further. "Cold, unforgiving. There are stories about what happened to the last steward who displeased him. No one speaks of it directly, but everyone knows to stay out of his path." Eliza thought of the flicker she had seen in his eyes, the brief crack in that unyielding composure. It did not match the picture the others painted of him. Though she said nothing of it aloud, she finished her meal in silence, her mind turning over the events of the day. That night, lying in the narrow bed of the servants' quarters, she stared up at the cracked plaster ceiling and listened to the wind pressing against the windows. She thought of her family, of the debts still owed, of the wages she needed to send home each month, if they were to keep any roof over their heads at all. She had come to this house to survive, not to make enemies of powerful men. And yet, some part of her did not regret what she had said. She had spent so long being invisible, being spoken over, being treated as though her feelings and her dignity were worth less than the porcelain figures that lined these grand hallways. For one moment in that gallery she had been seen, truly seen, not as a servant to be dismissed or ignored, but as a person capable of standing her ground. Whether that would cost her the position remained to be seen. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for whatever the morning would bring, and told herself that whatever happened next, she would not let this house make her small. Down the hall, in his private study, Duke Alaric Vane sat before a dying fire, a glass of untouched brandy resting on the table beside him. He had dismissed his valet an hour ago, wanting silence, wanting time to think through a conversation that continued to circle through his mind with irritating persistence. He had expected fear from her. He always received fear. It was the natural order of things in a house like his, in a world built entirely around the deference owed to men of his position. He had grown so accustomed to it that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to as an equal, to be challenged rather than appeased. And yet there had been no fear in Eliza Hartwell's eyes, only a quiet, burning defiance that refused to bend, even when bending would have cost her nothing but pride. He told himself it meant nothing. She was a servant, newly hired, likely to be gone within the week if Mrs. Prentice had her way. He had far more pressing matters to occupy his thoughts, matters of estate business and family obligation that required his full attention. And yet, As the fire burned low and the house settled into silence around him, his thoughts kept returning to the gallery, to the sound of porcelain shattering on marble, and to the steady, unshaken voice of a maid who had looked him in the eye and refused to look away. He did not understand why the memory unsettled him so deeply. But it did, and that unsettled him more than anything she had said. Morning arrived gray and damp, with fog pressing against the windows of Vane Manor like a living thing trying to get inside. Eliza woke before dawn, as she had been instructed, and dressed quickly in the cold, dim light of the servants' quarters. She half expected to find Mrs. Prentice waiting at her door with news of her dismissal. Instead, she found only a folded note pinned to the wall outside the kitchen, listing her tasks for the day in tight, careful handwriting. The list was longer than the day before, far longer. She was to scrub the stone floors of the lower kitchen corridor, polish every piece of silver in the east dining hall, beat the dust from a dozen heavy curtains, and haul water for the laundry from the well at the far end of the courtyard, a task usually shared among 3 maids rather than assigned to one. Eliza read the list twice, understanding immediately what it meant. Someone had decided to test her, to see how much weight she could carry before she broke, and begged to be released from her position. She rolled up her sleeves and began. By mid-morning, her hands were raw from scrubbing stone, and her back ached from bending over the silver polish for hours without pause. The other maids cast sympathetic glances her way as they passed, though none dared to help. Word had spread that the tasks had come directly from instructions passed down through the housekeeper, and no one wanted to draw attention to themselves by defying that chain of command, not after what had happened in the gallery. Charlotte found her during a brief pause near the well, hauling a heavy bucket of water with trembling arms. "This is not right," Charlotte whispered, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "No one is given this much work in a single day. Someone wants you gone." "Then they will be disappointed," Eliza said, though her voice was tight with exhaustion. "You cannot keep this pace forever. I do not intend to keep it forever. I intend to keep it long enough that whoever assigned this list grows tired of waiting for me to fail." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, something like admiration creeping into her expression. "You truly are not afraid of him, are you?" Eliza set down the bucket, flexing her aching fingers. "I am afraid. I simply refuse to let the fear decide how I behave." She returned to her work, task after task, hour after hour, until the sun began its slow descent behind the fog-covered hills. By evening, every muscle in her body screamed with fatigue, but she had completed the entire list, down to the last curtain and the last polished spoon. She reported to Mrs. Prentice in the housekeeper's small office, standing straight despite the exhaustion pulling at her frame. Mrs. Prentice looked up from her ledger, clearly surprised to see her standing there at all. "You finished the list?" "Every task, Mrs. Prentice." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed, studying Eliza's face for any sign of the collapse she had perhaps expected. Finding none, she simply nodded, though something in her expression had shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. "I look forward to it," Eliza said, and though her voice was steady, there was a faint edge of defiance beneath the words that Mrs. Prentice did not miss. That evening, as Eliza sat with the other servants over a modest supper, a commotion arose near the front entrance of the house. Carriage wheels crunched against the gravel outside, followed by the sound of voices, one of them sharp and imperious, cutting through the quiet of the evening like a blade. "Lady Constance Whitmore has arrived," one of the older maids announced, hurrying past with an armful of linens. "Everyone to your stations. She does not tolerate disorder." Eliza had heard the name mentioned in passing over the last 2 days, always with a note of caution in the speaker's voice. Lady Constance was a frequent visitor to Vane Manor, a woman of considerable standing whose family estate bordered the Duke's own lands. It was widely assumed among the staff that a match between the Duke and Lady Constance had long been expected, encouraged by both families for reasons of wealth and position rather than affection. Eliza caught her first glimpse of Lady Constance the following morning, while carrying a tray of tea into the drawing room. The woman was strikingly beautiful, with golden hair arranged in elaborate curls and a gown of pale blue silk that seemed to catch every ray of light in the room. But there was something cold in the set of her mouth, something calculating in the way her eyes moved over every person and object she encountered, weighing their worth and usefulness in an instant. Lady Constance's gaze landed on Eliza the moment she entered the room, and it lingered there, sharp and assessing. "You are new," Lady Constance said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "I do not recognize you." "Yes, my lady. I began my position 3 days ago." "How curious. Lady Constance's eyes flicked briefly toward the Duke, who sat near the window reading a letter with apparent disinterest, though Eliza noticed the faint tension in his shoulders that suggested he was listening far more closely than he appeared. "I have heard the strangest rumor about a new maid who dared to argue with His Grace in the long gallery. Surely that could not have been you." The room went still. Eliza set the tray down carefully on the low table, keeping her expression neutral even as her pulse quickened. "I only spoke honestly when I was addressed, my lady," she said. Lady Constance's smile did not reach her eyes. How refreshing. Most servants understand that honesty is not always a virtue in this house. She turned her attention fully toward Eliza now, her tone light but edged with something far sharper beneath the surface. "Tell me, girl, do you make a habit of speaking out of turn wherever you go, or is this house simply fortunate enough to receive your particular brand of courage?" Eliza felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground. "I try only to speak the truth, my lady, whether it is welcomed or not." "How very inconvenient for everyone around you." Lady Constance's laugh was light and musical, but it carried no warmth. She turned back toward the Duke, resting a hand delicately on the arm of her chair. "Alaric, you must tell me you intend to correct this insolence before it spreads through the entire household. Imagine the chaos if every maid believed she had the right to speak her mind to her betters." The Duke lowered his letter slowly, his gray eyes flicking toward Eliza for just a moment before settling on Lady Constance. "The household remains well managed, Constance. You need not concern yourself with matters that do not involve you." A flicker of surprise crossed Lady Constance's face before she smoothed it away, replacing it with practiced composure. "Of course. Forgive my curiosity." Eliza excused herself as quickly as propriety allowed, retreating to the kitchen with her heart pounding. She had felt the weight of Lady Constance's attention like a physical thing, cold and calculating, and she understood instinctively that she had made an enemy without ever intending to. Over the following days, the pattern continued. Lady Constance found reasons to linger near wherever Eliza was working, offering pointed remarks disguised as pleasant conversation, each one designed to remind Eliza of her place. The Duke, for his part, seemed to appear in Eliza's path with unusual frequency as well, though his reasons were less clear even to himself. She found him one afternoon standing in the small garden behind the east wing, where she had been sent to gather fresh herbs for the kitchen. He did not acknowledge her at first, his gaze fixed on the gray horizon beyond the garden wall. "You have survived 4 days in my household," he said finally, without turning. "Mrs. Prentice informs me this is something of a record for maids assigned the punishment list." "It was not meant as punishment, Your Grace, or so I was told." "We both know what it was meant as." He turned to face her now, his expression unreadable. "And yet you completed every task without complaint." "Complaining would not have made the work lighter," Eliza said. "It would only have given someone the satisfaction of watching me struggle." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing entirely. "You are an unusual woman, Eliza Hartwell. I have been told that more than once since arriving here, Your Grace." "Is it meant as an insult when they say it?" "Usually," she admitted, and to her surprise, he made a low sound that might almost have been a laugh. The moment stretched between them, quiet and strange, neither hostile nor entirely comfortable. Eliza found herself studying his face in a way she knew she should not, noticing the tension around his eyes, the weight he seemed to carry in his shoulders despite his position and wealth. Whatever coldness the household attributed to him, she was beginning to suspect it was not the whole truth of who he was. "You should return to your duties," he said abruptly, as though catching himself in something forbidden, "before Lady Constance finds another reason to comment on your conduct." "Of course, Your Grace." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the garden gate. "Eliza." She turned back. It was the first time he had spoken her name without the weight of formality attached to it, and something in her chest tightened at the sound of it. "Do not let her intimidate you," he said quietly. "Whatever else you do in this house, do not let anyone convince you to become smaller than you are." He turned and walked back toward the manor before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the garden, with the wind pulling at her skirts and her heart pounding for reasons she did not fully understand. That night, Lady Constance summoned Mrs. Prentice to her chambers, her voice cold and clipped as she outlined a list of complaints against the new maid. Complaints designed less to correct behavior than to plant seeds of doubt that might grow into something far more dangerous in the weeks to come. Mrs. Prentice listened, nodded where appropriate, and said nothing of the strange, quiet conversation she herself had witnessed from a distance, between the Duke and a maid who refused to bow. Something was shifting within the walls of Vane Manor, subtle as fog rolling across the hills, and not everyone within those walls welcomed the change. The following morning brought fresh instructions from Mrs. Prentice, though this time the list of tasks seemed almost ordinary compared to the punishing schedule of the days before. Eliza wondered whether the housekeeper had softened toward her, or whether Lady Constance's growing displeasure had simply made the older woman cautious about drawing further attention to the matter. Either way, she welcomed the reprieve, even as she remained watchful, aware that calm rarely lasted long in a house so thick with unspoken rivalries. She spent much of the day in the linen room, sorting through fine embroidered sheets and folding them with careful precision, a task that allowed her mind to wander, even as her hands stayed busy. She thought of her family often during these quiet hours, picturing her mother's tired face and her younger brother's hopeful letters, each one asking when she might be able to send more of her wages home. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her constantly, a reminder that whatever pride she carried into her confrontations with the Duke and Lady Constance, she could not afford to let that pride cost her the position entirely. It was Charlotte who found her there in the late afternoon, slipping into the linen room with a conspiratorial look on her face. "You will not believe what I overheard," Charlotte whispered, closing the door softly behind her. "Lady Constance was speaking with her maid this morning, complaining about you at great length. She called you insolent. She called you dangerous." "Dangerous," Eliza repeated, unable to stop the small, disbelieving laugh that escaped her. "I fold linens and scrub floors, Charlotte. I hardly think I pose a threat to a woman of her standing." "She does not see it that way," Charlotte said, lowering her voice further still. "She sees the way His Grace looks at you. Everyone has begun to notice it, even if no one dares speak of it openly. You should be careful, Eliza. Women like Lady Constance do not lose gracefully, and they do not forgive easily either." Eliza set down the sheet she had been folding, considering her friend's words with more seriousness than she wanted to admit. She had noticed the shift herself, the way the Duke's cold reserve seemed to crack slightly whenever their paths crossed, the way his voice softened almost imperceptibly when he spoke her name. She told herself it meant nothing, that a man of his position would never seriously consider a servant as anything more than a passing curiosity, but some small part of her had begun to wonder if that certainty was beginning to waver. "I have given her no reason to see me as a rival," Eliza said finally. "I have only tried to survive here with whatever dignity I have left." "Sometimes that is reason enough," Charlotte said quietly. "Dignity threatens people who believe it belongs only to them." The two young women finished their work in companionable silence after that, though Eliza's thoughts remained troubled long after Charlotte had gone. She understood, with growing clarity, that whatever quiet connection had begun to form between herself and the Duke carried consequences far beyond the simple exchange of words in a garden. Lady Constance was not a woman who would allow a servant to threaten her position without retaliation, and Eliza had no illusions about how easily someone in her circumstances could be removed from a household, her reputation destroyed along with her livelihood, with nothing more than a well-placed accusation. That evening, as the household settled into its usual rhythm of quiet after the evening meal, Eliza found herself standing near the window of the servants' corridor, watching the last light fade over the distant hills. She thought of the Duke's words in the garden, the quiet insistence that she not let anyone make her smaller than she was. It had felt, in that moment, like more than simple encouragement. It had felt like something closer to understanding, as though he recognized in her a struggle not entirely unlike his own. She did not know what to make of that recognition, or where it might lead if she allowed herself to trust it. But as she turned away from the window and made her way toward her narrow bed, she carried with her a small, stubborn flicker of hope that refused to be extinguished, no matter how carefully Lady Constance watched her, and no matter how uncertain the days ahead might prove to be. The invitation arrived 3 days later, carried by a footman on a silver tray to the housekeeper's office, and within hours the entire staff of Vane Manor had thrown themselves into preparation for what would become the largest dinner the house had hosted in over a year. Lady Constance had convinced the Duke, through means no one below stairs fully understood, to host a formal gathering for the surrounding gentry, an evening meant to celebrate the autumn season but which everyone quietly understood to be something else entirely. It was an opportunity, carefully engineered, for Lady Constance to stake her claim before witnesses who mattered. Eliza was assigned to assist in the dining hall itself, a task that placed her in dangerously close proximity to the very woman who had made her displeasure so clear over the preceding weeks. She spent the day polishing crystal glasses until they gleamed under the candlelight, arranging silverware with exacting precision, and trying her best to remain invisible among the flurry of activity surrounding the preparations. By evening, the great dining hall had been transformed into something out of a painting. Long tables draped in white linen, candles flickering in silver holders down the length of the room, and the soft murmur of a string quartet drifting in from the adjoining parlor. Guests began arriving as the sun set, filling the hall with the rustle of silk gowns and the low hum of polite conversation, none of the arriving lords and ladies sparing so much as a glance for the servants moving quietly among them. Eliza took her place near the far wall, ready to assist wherever needed, doing her best to remain unnoticed. She watched as Lady Constance made her entrance on the Duke's arm, resplendent in a gown of deep crimson that seemed designed specifically to draw every eye in the room toward her. The pairing looked, to any outside observer, exactly as intended, a future Duke and Duchess presiding over their guests with practiced elegance. The Duke's expression, however, told a different story to anyone who knew to look closely. His jaw remained tight throughout the greetings, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, and more than once Eliza caught him glancing toward the far wall where the servants stood, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than propriety allowed, before he forced his attention back to his guests. Dinner proceeded through its many courses without incident, the conversation flowing easily among the gathered nobility, touching on matters of politics, marriage prospects, and the state of the harvest. Eliza moved quietly among the tables, refilling glasses and clearing plates, doing her best to remain a shadow at the edges of the grand room. It was during the final course, as dessert was being served and the wine had loosened tongues throughout the hall, that Lady Constance chose her moment. "Alaric," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the nearby tables, "I understand you have quite the interesting addition to your household staff these days. A maid, I am told, who believes herself entitled to speak her mind to her betters." A ripple of curious attention moved through the guests seated nearby. The Duke's expression darkened, though he said nothing at first, clearly hoping the comment might pass without further escalation. Lady Constance, however, was not finished. Her eyes found Eliza across the room, and a cold, satisfied smile spread across her face. "There she is now. Come here, girl." The room fell silent, every head turned. Eliza's heart pounded violently in her chest as she made her way slowly toward the head table, acutely aware of dozens of eyes tracking her every movement, of the weight of judgment already settling over her before a single word had been spoken. "Yes, my lady," she said, stopping a respectful distance away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. "Tell our guests," Lady Constance said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "about the incident in the gallery. I understand you argued quite fiercely with His Grace over a broken figurine. Do enlighten us. I am certain everyone here would find it fascinating to hear how a servant addresses her master these days." Eliza felt the heat of every gaze in the room pressing against her skin. She could see the Duke's jaw clench tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table, though he had not yet found the words to intervene. She understood, in that moment, precisely what Lady Constance intended. This was not curiosity. This was a public execution, designed to humiliate her so thoroughly that she would have no choice but to resign, or worse, to be dismissed on the spot for the crime of embarrassing her betters before an audience. She thought of her family, of the wages she could not afford to lose, of every reason she had to simply bow her head and apologize for something that required no apology at all. And then she thought of the Duke's words in the garden, quiet and insistent, telling her not to let anyone make her smaller than she was. She lifted her chin. "There is little to tell, my lady," Eliza said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the silent hall. "I broke a valuable object by accident, and when His Grace expressed his displeasure, I responded honestly rather than with false groveling. I do not believe honesty is a crime, even for someone in my position." A murmur moved through the assembled guests, though whether of scandal or grudging respect, Eliza could not tell. Lady Constance's smile tightened, her eyes flashing with something colder now. "How very bold of you to speak so freely in front of your betters. Tell me, do you believe yourself equal to the company gathered in this room?" "I believe," Eliza said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate precision, "that honesty and respect should not depend on the size of a person's fortune or the grandness of their title. I have tried only to conduct myself with dignity, my lady, nothing more." "Dignity," Lady Constance repeated, her laugh sharp and brittle. "How charming, that a maid believes herself entitled to such a thing." It was then that the Duke rose from his seat. The room, already silent, seemed to still further at the sound of his chair scraping against the floor. Every guest turned to watch him, uncertain what he intended, and Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat, bracing herself for whatever punishment he might now feel compelled to deliver in front of his assembled peers. Instead, he looked directly at Lady Constance, his gray eyes cold in a way Eliza had not seen since her first encounter with him in the gallery. "Dignity," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, "is not a privilege reserved for those of noble birth, Constance. It is earned through conduct, through honesty, through the courage to speak truthfully, even when doing so carries risk. I have watched this young woman conduct herself with more integrity in a single week than I have witnessed from most of the guests seated at this table tonight." Gasps rippled through the room. Lady Constance's face went white, then flushed with fury, her carefully composed mask cracking entirely for the first time that evening. "Alaric, surely you cannot mean to defend a servant over a guest in your own home," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "I mean precisely what I said." The Duke's gaze swept over the assembled guests, cold and unyielding. This dinner was meant to celebrate the season, not to serve as a stage for cruelty disguised as wit. "I will not permit anyone in my household, servant or guest, to be humiliated for sport at my table." The silence that followed was absolute. Eliza stood frozen at the center of it, scarcely able to believe what she had just witnessed. The most powerful man in the room, a man known throughout the county for his cold detachment, had just defended her, publicly and without hesitation, against a woman his own family had long expected him to marry. Lady Constance rose from her seat, her composure shattered beyond repair. "I see," she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "Forgive me for misunderstanding the nature of this household, Your Grace." She swept from the room without another word, her crimson gown trailing behind her like a wound, leaving a stunned silence in her wake that no one among the assembled guests seemed willing to break. The Duke turned to Eliza, his expression unreadable once more, though something in his eyes had softened considerably from the coldness he had directed at Lady Constance only moments before. "You may return to your duties, Eliza. Thank you for your patience this evening." "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, before retreating from the hall as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart pounding so violently she feared everyone around her could hear it. She found refuge in the small pantry off the kitchen, pressing her back against the cool stone wall and closing her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She had expected humiliation. She had expected dismissal. Instead, she had witnessed something she still could not fully comprehend, a man of immense power choosing, in front of everyone whose opinion mattered most to his standing in society, to defend a maid over the woman his family had long groomed him to marry. Charlotte found her there minutes later, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Eliza, everyone is talking about what just happened. No one has ever seen him speak to Lady Constance that way. No one has ever seen him defend a servant like that." "I do not know what it means," Eliza admitted, her voice still unsteady. "I think," Charlotte said slowly, "it means more than either of you is ready to admit." Eliza said nothing, though she could not deny the truth of it settling heavily in her chest. Whatever careful distance she had tried to maintain between herself and the Duke, whatever practical reasons she had given herself for ignoring the strange current that ran between them, had just been shattered as thoroughly as the porcelain figure that had started it all. Word of the confrontation spread through the household before the guests had even finished departing for the evening, and by the time the last carriage rolled away from Vane Manor, every servant from the scullery maid to the head groundskeeper knew that something fundamental had shifted within the walls of the great house. Lady Constance had been humiliated in front of the very society she sought to command, and no one, least of all Eliza herself, believed for a moment that she would allow such a defeat to pass without consequence. Somewhere beyond the manor walls, in the darkness of her own carriage rattling back toward her family estate, Lady Constance sat with her hands clenched into fists in her lap, already turning her fury into something far more dangerous than wounded pride. She would not be made a fool of, not by a duke who had forgotten his obligations, and certainly not by a maid who had forgotten her place. Whatever it took, she intended to remind them both of exactly where they stood. Back at the manor, the great dining hall had emptied of its guests, though the staff remained for hours afterward, clearing away the remnants of the evening in near total silence. Eliza worked alongside the others, gathering crystal glasses and folding linens, her mind still turning over the events of the night in restless circles. She could not shake the image of the Duke rising from his seat, his voice cutting through the silence with such certainty, defending her without hesitation in front of the very people whose good opinion he had spent his entire life cultivating. Mrs. Prentice approached her near midnight, as the last of the candles were being extinguished throughout the hall. The housekeeper's expression was difficult to read, a mixture of caution and something that might almost have been respect. "You have made a powerful enemy tonight," Mrs. Prentice said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could overhear. Lady Constance does not forgive humiliation easily, and she has resources at her disposal that a maid in your position cannot begin to match. I did nothing to invite her anger beyond speaking honestly when I was addressed, Eliza said. That may be true, Mrs. Prentice said, but truth rarely matters to those who feel their pride has been wounded. Be careful, Eliza. Watch what you say. Watch who you trust. And above all, do not let this evening convince you that you have won anything permanent. Women like Lady Constance do not simply retreat. They regroup. The warning settled heavily in Eliza's chest as she made her way back to the servants' quarters that night. The manor grown quiet and dark around her, the grand portraits in the long gallery watching her pass with the same painted indifference they had shown on her very first day. She undressed slowly, her body aching with exhaustion, and lay awake long after the candle had been snuffed, staring into the darkness and turning Mrs. Prentice's words over in her mind. She thought, too, of the Duke, of the strange transformation she had witnessed in him over the course of the evening. The cold, unreadable man who had confronted her in the gallery just days earlier had stood before an entire room of his peers and chosen honesty over convenience, dignity over the comfortable arrangement his family had long expected of him. She did not know what to make of the warmth that had settled in her chest at the memory, nor did she trust herself to examine it too closely. A duke and a maid belonged to entirely different worlds, worlds that were never meant to intersect beyond the boundaries of servant and master. Whatever he had done tonight, however unexpected and however deeply it had moved her, she could not allow herself to imagine it meant anything more than a momentary defense of principle. And yet, sleep did not come easily, and when it finally did, her dreams carried the echo of his voice, steady and unwavering, declaring before a room full of strangers that her dignity was not a privilege to be granted or withheld by anyone but herself. The following morning brought a household transformed by whispers. Every maid, every footman, every member of the kitchen staff seemed to know some version of what had happened at the dinner, the stories growing more elaborate with each retelling as they passed from mouth to mouth through the corridors and stairwells of the great house. Some claimed the Duke had nearly struck Lady Constance for her cruelty. Others insisted he had declared his intentions toward Eliza outright, a claim so far from the truth that Eliza felt her face burn with embarrassment each time she overheard it. She kept to her duties as best she could, hoping the attention would fade with time, though she understood, with a growing sense of unease, that nothing in this house ever seemed to fade quietly. Lady Constance's carriage had not returned to Vane Manor in the days that followed, but the absence itself felt heavier than her presence ever had, a silence that promised something was being carefully, patiently arranged behind closed doors, far from the manor's watchful eyes. The Duke, for his part, said nothing further about the incident, though Eliza noticed a subtle shift in the way he carried himself around her whenever their paths crossed. There was less distance now, less careful formality, as though the events of that evening had stripped away some final barrier neither of them had been willing to acknowledge before. He no longer looked away quickly when their eyes met across a room. He no longer pretended indifference when she entered a space he occupied. It should have frightened her more than it did. A man of his position, showing such open regard for a servant, invited scrutiny and scandal in equal measure, and Eliza understood better than most the danger of being caught in the gravity of someone so far above her station. And yet, when she allowed herself a rare, private moment to consider it honestly, she could not deny that some part of her welcomed the shift, welcomed the quiet, steady warmth that had begun to grow in the space between them, however impossible it seemed for it to lead anywhere safe. She resolved, as the days passed, to guard herself carefully against expectations that could only end in heartbreak, but resolve, she was quickly learning, proved far more difficult to maintain than she had ever imagined it would be. A week passed before the first accusation arrived, delivered not directly but through the careful, deniable channels that people of influence preferred when they wished to destroy someone without dirtying their own hands. Mrs. Prentice summoned Eliza to her office on a gray morning, her expression grave in a way that made Eliza's stomach tighten with dread, before a single word had been spoken. "A letter arrived this morning from Lady Constance's household," Mrs. Prentice said, holding a folded paper in her hands as though it might burn her fingers. "It contains a serious accusation against you." "What accusation?" Eliza asked, though something cold had already begun to settle in her chest. "That you have been stealing from the manor, small items, easily overlooked. A silver spoon here, a length of lace there. Lady Constance claims one of her own maids witnessed you slipping items into your apron pocket during your first week of service." Eliza's disbelief gave way quickly to fury, though she forced herself to remain calm, understanding that any outburst would only lend credibility to the very accusation she needed to disprove. "That is a lie, Mrs. Prentice. I have taken nothing from this house that did not belong to me. You may search my belongings this instant if it would ease your doubts." "I do not doubt you," Mrs. Prentice said, and something in her tone suggested this admission cost her more than she wished to reveal. "But doubt is not the issue. The accusation itself is enough to end your position here, regardless of its truth, if His Grace chooses to believe it." "Then I must speak with him directly," Eliza said. "I will not stand silently while a lie destroys everything I have worked for." She found the Duke in his study that afternoon, having sent word through a footman requesting an audience, an unusual request from a maid that nonetheless earned her prompt admission through the heavy oak doors she had been told never to approach. He sat behind a wide mahogany desk covered in papers, his expression unreadable as she entered, though something in his posture suggested he had already heard of the accusation before she arrived. "Your Grace," she said, standing before his desk with her chin lifted despite the trembling she fought to keep from her voice. "I understand a serious claim has been made against me. I wish to address it directly, and I ask only that you allow me the chance to defend myself before any judgment is passed." He set down his pen slowly, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "Lady Constance's letter arrived this morning. She claims quite specific and damning evidence against you. Then I ask that this evidence be examined properly, Your Grace, rather than accepted on the word of a woman who has made her hostility toward me abundantly clear." Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been approval, or perhaps simply relief. "I have already begun looking into the matter myself," he said. "I sent word to the housekeeper of Lady Constance's estate this morning, requesting the name of the maid who claims to have witnessed your supposed theft." Eliza had not expected this, had braced herself for judgment rather than investigation, and the surprise of it left her momentarily speechless. "You did not simply accept the accusation as truth?" "I have learned, over the course of my life, that accusations delivered with such urgency, and so little evidence, often reveal more about the accuser than the accused." He rose from behind his desk, moving toward the window that overlooked the gray, misty hills beyond the manor grounds. "Lady Constance has made her displeasure with you quite clear since the evening of the dinner. It would be foolish of me to accept her claims without question, particularly given the timing." "Then you believe me?" He turned to face her, and for a moment, the careful distance he usually maintained seemed to dissolve entirely. "I believe you, Eliza. I have believed you since the moment you first spoke to me in that gallery, when you had every reason to lie and every opportunity to grovel, and chose honesty instead. A woman capable of that kind of courage does not become a thief the moment my back is turned." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, bitter winter, and she found herself struggling to hold back the emotion rising in her chest. "Thank you, Your Grace. I do not know how else to express what your trust means to me." "You need not express anything," he said quietly. "You need only continue being exactly who you already are." The investigation that followed unfolded quickly, and its results arrived within 2 days, delivered by a messenger who had traveled to Lady Constance's estate, and returned with information that painted an entirely different picture than the one presented in her letter. The maid Lady Constance had named as her witness, when questioned privately by the Duke's own steward, admitted under gentle but firm questioning that she had seen nothing of the sort, that she had only been instructed by her mistress to confirm whatever story was presented to her, under threat of losing her own position should she refuse. The revelation spread through Vane Manor with the same speed as the rumors that had preceded it, though this time, the whispers carried a very different tone. Lady Constance had not simply been rejected by the Duke in a moment of public embarrassment. She had been caught fabricating a criminal accusation against an innocent servant, a scheme so transparent in its cruelty that even those among the staff who had once viewed her with cautious respect now spoke her name with open disdain. Eliza received the news from Mrs. Prentice in the same small office where the accusation had first been delivered, though the housekeeper's demeanor now carried none of the earlier gravity. "You have been cleared entirely," Mrs. Prentice said, something almost like warmth softening her usually stern features. "His Grace has instructed that no further action be taken against you, and that the matter be considered closed." "Thank you for telling me," Eliza said, relief washing through her so completely that she felt momentarily lightheaded. "I will admit," Mrs. Prentice continued, folding her hands together carefully, "I did not expect His Grace to involve himself so personally in the matter. In all my years serving this household, I have never known him to investigate an accusation against a servant with such determination. He might simply have accepted Lady Constance's word and dismissed you without a second thought. Many masters would have done exactly that." "He did not seem inclined to believe her," Eliza said carefully, uncertain how much of her own feelings she wished to reveal to the housekeeper. Mrs. Prentice studied her for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. No, she agreed slowly, he did not. The weeks that followed brought a strange, cautious peace to the manor. Lady Constance did not return, and though her absence was never explained directly to the staff, the servants understood well enough that her standing within the household, and perhaps within the wider circles of gentry that mattered most to her ambitions, had suffered a wound from which it would not easily recover. Whispers reached the kitchen occasionally of her fury, of accusations made against the Duke to anyone within her family who would listen, but nothing came of these complaints beyond further damage to her own reputation. Eliza found herself in the quiet aftermath, settling into a rhythm at Vane Manor that felt, for the first time since her arrival, almost peaceful. Her duties remained demanding, but no longer carried the deliberate cruelty of those early days, and she found herself increasingly trusted with tasks that placed her in closer proximity to the Duke himself. Tasks she suspected, though she never spoke the suspicion aloud, had been arranged with quiet deliberation rather than simple necessity. Their conversations, when they occurred, grew longer and less guarded, small moments stolen in hallways and gardens that neither of them acknowledged as anything more than pleasant exchanges between two people who had weathered difficulty together. But Eliza was not foolish enough to believe the growing warmth between them existed in isolation, unnoticed by the rest of the household, or unremarked upon by those who still remembered the danger that had so recently threatened to destroy everything she had worked to build. Lady Constance's silence, she understood with growing unease, was not surrender. It was simply the quiet that preceded a storm gathering strength somewhere beyond the horizon, waiting for the moment it might strike with far greater force than before. One evening, as autumn deepened into the first cold breath of winter, Eliza was asked to deliver a stack of correspondence to the Duke's study, a task usually reserved for his personal secretary, who had taken ill that week. She found him standing near the fireplace, his coat discarded over the back of a chair, his usual formal bearing softened by the privacy of the hour. "You need not have brought these yourself," he said, glancing up as she entered. "I would have understood if you sent one of the footmen instead." "I did not mind, Your Grace," she said, setting the letters carefully on his desk. "The walk gave me a few quiet moments to myself." He studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "Do you find so little quiet in this house?" "Quiet is a rare thing for anyone who works below stairs," she admitted, a small smile touching her lips despite herself, "though I have found more of it here than I expected when I first arrived." "And has your opinion of this house changed, then, since that first difficult day in the gallery?" She considered the question carefully before answering, aware of how much weight it seemed to carry beneath its simple phrasing. "I arrived here afraid, Your Grace. Afraid of losing my position, afraid of disappointing my family, afraid, I suppose, of you most of all. I do not feel that same fear any longer. What do you feel instead?" His voice had grown quieter, the distance between them narrowing, without either of them seeming to notice the shift. "I am not entirely certain I have the words for it," she said honestly. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance from where she stood, though the space between them felt charged with something neither of them dared to name directly. "I find myself in a similar difficulty," he admitted. "I have spent my life being told precisely what I should want, who I should marry, how I should conduct myself in every circumstance that matters to my family's standing. I have never once been asked what I actually wish for myself." "And what do you wish for, Your Grace?" she asked softly. For a long moment he did not answer, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I am beginning to understand that answer more clearly with each passing day," he said finally. "Though I suspect it is not an answer, either of us is yet prepared to speak aloud." The moment stretched between them, fragile and uncertain, until the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside broke the spell entirely. Eliza stepped back quickly, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled slightly, while the Duke returned to the safety of formality with practiced ease. "Thank you for delivering the letters," he said, his voice once more carrying the measured distance expected between master and servant. "Of course, Your Grace." She curtsied briefly and left the study, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might be heard through the walls, carrying with her the unspoken words that had passed between them, words that promised far more than either of them was yet willing to admit. She did not sleep easily that night, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation, around the way his voice had softened, around the quiet admission that he too felt something neither of them fully understood. She told herself, as she had told herself so many times before, that nothing could truly come of such feelings, that the distance between a duke and a maid was far too vast to be bridged by anything so fragile as growing affection. And yet, for the first time since her arrival at Vane Manor, she allowed herself to wonder, just briefly, whether that distance might not be as impossible to cross as she had always believed. The letter arrived on a bitterly cold morning, slipped beneath the door of the servants' quarters sometime before dawn, addressed to Eliza in handwriting she did not recognize. She opened it with hands stiff from the cold, and as she read the words inside, the blood drained from her face entirely. The letter contained details of her father's business failure that no one at Vane Manor should have known, details that went beyond simple financial ruin into accusations of fraud, claims that her father had knowingly deceived his creditors before the collapse of his business, a crime that could see him imprisoned if pursued formally. The letter made clear, in cold, precise language, that this information would be delivered to the appropriate authorities and to every family of standing in the county, unless Eliza resigned her position at Vane Manor immediately and left without explanation. There was no signature, but Eliza did not need one to know who had written it. She spent the morning in a daze, moving through her duties mechanically while her mind raced through impossible calculations. Her father had made mistakes, certainly, poor decisions born of desperation as his business crumbled around him, but he had never knowingly defrauded anyone. She knew this with the certainty of a daughter who had watched her father weep quietly at their kitchen table late at night, believing himself alone, mourning the ruin of everything he had built through decades of honest labor. Whether the accusations in the letter held any legal weight or not, she understood that the mere suggestion of fraud, spread through the right channels, could destroy what little remained of her family's standing, and plunge them into a scandal from which they might never recover. She found Lady Constance's letter still trembling in her hands hours later, standing alone in the small garden where the Duke had once told her not to let anyone make her smaller than she was. The irony of the location was not lost on her, even as panic clawed at her chest. It was Charlotte who found her there, her face pale with worry the moment she saw Eliza's expression. "What has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost." Eliza handed her the letter wordlessly, watching her friend's expression shift from confusion to horror as she read through the careful, cruel threats contained within. "She would truly do this," Charlotte said quietly, her voice tight with disbelief. "She would destroy your family simply to remove you from this house." "I do not know what to do," Eliza admitted, her composure finally cracking under the weight of the threat. "If I resign and leave quietly, perhaps she will let the matter rest. But if I stay, she may carry through with her threat regardless, and my father could lose everything, perhaps even his freedom." "You cannot simply give in to her," Charlotte said fiercely. "This is exactly what she wants, for you to be so frightened that you destroy yourself before she has to lift a finger further. And if I do not give in, and she carries out her threat anyway?" Charlotte had no answer for that, and the two young women stood together in troubled silence, the cold wind pulling at their skirts as the weight of an impossible decision settled between them. Eliza made her choice that afternoon, though it cost her every ounce of courage she possessed. Rather than resign quietly or wait helplessly for Lady Constance to act, she requested a carriage and traveled the short distance to Lady Constance's estate, arriving unannounced and demanding an audience that the startled household staff seemed uncertain whether to grant a mere maid from a neighboring house. She was eventually shown into a small sitting room, where Lady Constance received her with an expression of icy amusement, clearly delighted by the desperation that had driven a servant to seek her out directly. "I confess I did not expect you to come here yourself," Lady Constance said, settling into a chair with deliberate leisure. "How very bold of you." "I have come to ask you to reconsider what you have threatened," Eliza said, her voice steadier than she felt. "My father made mistakes, but he committed no fraud. The accusations in your letter are false, and you know this." "Do I?" Lady Constance's smile was cold and sharp as broken glass. "Truth has never been the point, my dear. Perception is what matters in circles such as mine. Whether the accusations are true or false is irrelevant once they have been spoken aloud to the right people. Your family's reputation would be destroyed regardless of what actually occurred." "Then what do you want from me?" Eliza asked, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "I have already told you I have no designs on anything beyond honest employment in this house." "I want you gone," Lady Constance said, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the raw fury beneath. "I want you gone from Vane Manor, gone from this county, gone from any place where you might continue to poison a match that has been planned since before either of us were born. You have humiliated me in front of everyone who matters, and I will not simply forgive that because you have decided to appear before me with wide, pleading eyes." "I never sought to humiliate you," Eliza said. "I only refused to be humiliated myself." "Then you should have understood the consequences of that refusal before you spoke," Lady Constance snapped. "You have until the end of the week to leave Vane Manor and never return." If you refuse, your father's reputation, and quite possibly his freedom, will suffer for your stubbornness." Eliza left the estate with her resolve badly shaken, uncertain how she could possibly resolve a threat that gave her no acceptable path forward. She returned to Vane Manor as the sun began to set, her thoughts consumed entirely by the impossible choice before her, and it was in this state, distracted and heartbroken, that she nearly collided with the Duke himself in the entrance hall. "Eliza." His voice carried immediate concern the moment he saw her expression. "What has happened? You look as though you have been crying." She hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect him from involvement in a matter that might damage his own standing, and the desperate need to share the burden that had grown too heavy to carry alone. In the end, exhaustion and fear won over caution, and the entire story spilled from her in halting, broken sentences: the letter, the threat, her desperate visit to Lady Constance's estate, and the impossible ultimatum she now faced. The Duke's expression darkened with each word, his jaw tightening until it seemed carved from stone entirely. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment, his gray eyes burning with a fury she had never witnessed from him before, not even in their first confrontation in the gallery. "She would truly threaten an innocent man's freedom simply to remove you from my household," he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "She believes I threaten her position, Your Grace. I do not know how to convince her otherwise." "You need not convince her of anything," he said. "This ends now." He summoned his carriage that same evening, refusing to wait until morning despite the lateness of the hour, and Eliza found herself accompanying him, along with Mrs. Prentice as a witness, on the short journey back to Lady Constance's estate. The Duke's fury had settled into something colder and more dangerous by the time they arrived, a controlled rage that seemed to radiate from him with every step he took toward the house. Lady Constance received them with visible surprise, her earlier confidence faltering slightly at the sight of the Duke's expression. "Alaric, I did not expect you at this hour," she said, attempting to recover her composure. "I have come to discuss the letter you sent to Eliza Hartwell this morning," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth she might have once expected from him. "The letter threatening false accusations of fraud against her father." Lady Constance's face paled, though she attempted to maintain her composure. "I do not know what you are referring to. Do not insult me with denials," he said. "I have already sent word to the magistrate regarding the true circumstances of Eliza's father's business failure, circumstances I have had investigated thoroughly enough to know they contain no fraud whatsoever. Should you proceed with your threats, Constance, you will find yourself facing charges of your own, for attempting to fabricate a criminal accusation against an innocent man, in order to blackmail his daughter." The color drained further from Lady Constance's face as the reality of her situation began to settle over her. "You would truly ruin my standing to protect a servant. I would ruin the standing of anyone who threatens the people I care for," he said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "You have made your choice tonight, Constance. Withdraw your threats entirely, or face the consequences of your own actions. Consequences I promise you will be far more severe than anything you have attempted to inflict on Eliza." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, until finally Lady Constance's shoulders sagged, her carefully constructed composure crumbling entirely under the weight of a defeat she could no longer deny. "Very well," she said quietly, her voice stripped of its earlier venom. "I will send no further letters. The matter is closed. See that it remains closed," the Duke said, before turning and offering his arm to Eliza, guiding her back toward the waiting carriage without another glance toward the woman who had once believed herself destined to become his wife. The ride back to Vane Manor passed in silence, though it was a silence filled with something warmer than the fear and uncertainty of the hours before. Eliza sat across from the Duke, watching the darkened countryside pass beyond the carriage window, still trying to comprehend the fierce, unwavering loyalty he had shown her that evening, a loyalty that had risked his own reputation to protect a servant's family from ruin. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the carriage and took her hand gently in his own, his gray eyes soft in the dim lantern light. "You need never thank me for protecting what matters to me, Eliza. I only wish I had understood sooner exactly how much that has come to include you." Neither of them spoke further as the carriage carried them home through the darkness, but the quiet understanding that passed between them needed no further words to make its meaning clear. The days following that confrontation brought a strange and unfamiliar calm to Vane Manor. Though calm, Eliza was quickly learning, rarely announced itself without carrying some undercurrent of change close behind. She wrote to her father that same week, informing him gently of the danger that had passed, though she chose not to burden him with every detail of how close disaster had truly come to their door. His reply arrived within days, full of gratitude and quiet relief, along with a hesitant question about the household she now served, a question she found herself unable to answer honestly, without revealing feelings she had not yet fully admitted even to herself. She saw the Duke often in the days that followed, their conversations no longer confined to brief, stolen moments in hallways and gardens. He began seeking her out directly, finding reasons, transparent though they were, to request her presence for small tasks that could easily have been assigned to any other servant. Mrs. Prentice said nothing of the pattern, though Eliza caught the older woman watching them both with an expression that mixed concern and something gentler, something almost like quiet approval, whenever their paths crossed within the household. It was Charlotte who finally spoke aloud what everyone in the servants' quarters had begun to whisper among themselves. "You must know what people are saying," Charlotte said one evening, as the two young women sat together mending linens by candlelight. "They say His Grace has not looked at another woman since the night he confronted Lady Constance on your behalf. They say he has become a different man since your arrival." "People exaggerate," Eliza said, though her cheeks warmed at the words. "Do they?" Charlotte set down her needle, studying her friend carefully. "I have worked in this house for 3 years, Eliza. I have never once seen him smile the way he smiles when you enter a room. I have never seen him linger in a doorway simply hoping to exchange a few words with someone below his station. Whatever this is, it is not exaggeration." Eliza said nothing, though she could not deny the truth curling quietly beneath Charlotte's observation. She had felt the shift herself, in every glance that lingered a moment too long, in every conversation that stretched further than propriety strictly allowed, in the memory of his hand closing gently around hers in the darkness of the carriage, warm and steady and entirely unlike anything she had expected to find within these cold, grand walls. And yet fear remained, quiet but persistent, whispering doubts she could not fully silence. Lady Constance's defeat had been decisive, but Eliza understood enough of the world beyond Vane Manor to know that a duke's affection for a servant, however genuine, invited scrutiny and scandal from every corner of society that mattered to a man of his position. She did not know whether whatever had grown between them could survive that scrutiny, or whether it was destined to remain forever confined to quiet gardens and darkened carriages, never permitted to step fully into the light. She found him one evening in the long gallery, standing before the very pedestal where the broken porcelain figure had once stood, now replaced with a simple vase of white lilies. He turned as she approached, his expression softening in the particular way it always did when their eyes met. "I find myself returning to this spot more often than I would like to admit," he said, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips. "It seems fitting, somehow, that everything between us began here, with a shattered heirloom and a maid who forgot her place," Eliza said, unable to fully suppress her own smile. "With a maid who refused to forget herself," he corrected gently. "There is a difference, Eliza, though I did not fully understand it myself until you taught it to me." She stepped closer, drawn by something she no longer had the strength or the desire to resist. "I have been afraid these past weeks to hope for anything beyond what circumstance has already granted me. A man of your position, and a woman of mine, exist in worlds that are not supposed to touch. And yet they have touched," he said quietly, closing the remaining distance between them. "Every rule I was raised to honor tells me this should be impossible. And yet I find I no longer care for rules that would ask me to pretend I do not feel exactly what I feel." "What do you feel?" she asked softly, echoing the question she had once posed to him in his study. This time he did not hesitate. "I feel as though I have spent my entire life waiting for someone to challenge me, to see past the title and the fortune to whatever remains of the man underneath. I did not expect that person to arrive dressed in a housemaid's apron, breaking porcelain and refusing to apologize for it. But I would not trade the discovery for anything the world has offered me before." The gallery held its breath around them, the painted ancestors watching silently from their frames as the Duke reached out and gently took her hand, the same gesture he had offered in the carriage, though this time neither fear nor danger stood between them to interrupt the moment. Eliza felt something settle deep within her chest, a certainty she had not allowed herself to trust until this very instant, that whatever obstacles still remained between them, whatever whispers and scandal might yet follow, she was no longer facing them alone. Word of the quiet understanding between the Duke and his maid could not remain contained within the walls of Vane Manor forever, and within a fortnight, the whispers had traveled beyond the servants' quarters and into the drawing rooms of the county's gentry, carried by guests who had witnessed the confrontation at the autumn dinner, and by servants whose loyalty could be purchased with enough coin. Lady Constance, despite her earlier defeat, had not remained entirely silent, choosing instead to plant careful seeds of scandal among her remaining allies, hoping that public pressure might accomplish what her direct threats had failed to achieve. The pressure mounted quickly. Letters arrived at Vane Manor from distant relatives of the Duke, each one expressing concern over rumors that threatened to embarrass the family name. A cousin arrived unannounced one afternoon, delivering a lengthy lecture on duty and obligation that the Duke endured with visible patience before firmly and politely showing the man to the door. Even Mrs. Prentice, usually so composed, began to show signs of strain as the household braced itself for whatever confrontation seemed increasingly inevitable. Eliza felt the weight of it most keenly during her quiet moments alone, when doubt crept in despite every reassurance the Duke had offered her, and understood, with painful clarity, precisely what she was asking him to sacrifice, should their feelings for one another become public and permanent. The disappointment of his family, the judgment of his peers, the whispered scandal that would follow them both for years to come. She loved him. She had come to admit this fully to herself in the quiet hours of the night. But love alone did not erase the very real consequences that awaited a duke who chose a servant over the expectations of his entire world. It was this fear that drove her, one cold morning, to seek him out with a request that surprised him deeply. "I think I should leave Vane Manor," she said, standing before him in his study, her voice steady despite the ache the words caused her. "Not because I wish to, Your Grace, but because I fear what remaining here will cost you. Your family, your standing, everything you have built, all of it risks damage because of feelings that were never meant to exist between people in our positions." The Duke rose from his desk slowly, crossing the room until he stood directly before her, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Do you truly believe I would allow you to sacrifice yourself for the sake of my reputation?" "I believe you deserve the chance to choose a life free of scandal, Your Grace. I cannot in good conscience be the reason that choice is taken from you." "Eliza," he took her hands gently in his own, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that steadied her trembling more effectively than any argument could have. "I have spent my entire life bound by expectations that were never truly my own, obligations inherited rather than chosen. A life mapped out for me, before I ever had the chance to consider what I actually wanted for myself. You are the first thing in this entire existence that I have chosen freely, without regard for duty or family or the expectations of society. I will not release that choice simply because it proves inconvenient for people who have never once considered my own happiness in their calculations." "But the scandal," she began, though her protest carried far less conviction now. "Let them talk," he said firmly. "Let every drawing room in the county whisper whatever they wish. I have spent 30 years living my life for the approval of others. I find, quite suddenly, that their approval matters far less to me than the possibility of a lifetime spent beside someone who challenged me to become a better version of myself than I ever believed possible." Eliza felt tears gathering in her eyes, though they carried none of the fear that had plagued her only moments before. "I do not know how to be a duchess, Your Grace. I know how to scrub floors and polish silver and endure long days of difficult labor. I do not know the first thing about the world you were born into." "Then we shall learn together," he said, a small, genuine smile breaking across his usually composed features. "I confess I know very little about the world you were born into either, though I suspect I have much to learn from it. About courage, about honesty, about the kind of dignity that has nothing to do with birth or title." Their engagement was announced within the month, a decision that sent shockwaves through the county's gentry far beyond anything the earlier confrontation at the dinner had produced. Letters of protest arrived from distant relatives who had never once bothered to visit Vane Manor in years past, suddenly deeply concerned with matters of family honor now that their own inheritance prospects seemed potentially threatened by a match they considered beneath the family's dignity. The Duke answered each letter personally, with a patience and firmness that left no room for further argument, making clear that his decision had been made and would not be revisited regardless of the pressure brought against it. Lady Constance, upon hearing the news, made one final attempt to intervene, arriving at Vane Manor unannounced and demanding an audience that the Duke, after a moment's consideration, chose to grant, if only to ensure the matter reached its final, unambiguous conclusion. She found Eliza in the drawing room, arranging flowers for the evening meal, and the two women stood facing one another for the first time since the confrontation at Lady Constance's own estate weeks earlier. "You have truly won then," Lady Constance said, her voice carrying none of its earlier venom, replaced instead by something closer to exhausted resignation. "A maid, elevated to the position I spent my entire life preparing to claim." "I did not set out to win anything," Eliza said quietly. I only refused to allow myself to be diminished simply because others believed I should accept it. And yet here we stand, Lady Constance said, with everything I once believed certain now entirely lost to me. Eliza set down the flowers she had been arranging, studying the other woman carefully. There was no triumph in this moment, she realized, no satisfaction to be found in another person's defeat, however cruelly that person had once treated her. I hold no ill will toward you, my lady, despite everything that has passed between us. I hope, in time, you find a happiness of your own that does not depend on comparing yourself to anyone else's fortune. Lady Constance said nothing in response, though something in her rigid posture seemed to soften, just slightly, at the unexpected grace of the words. She left Vane Manor shortly afterward, and though the county continued to whisper about the scandal for weeks to come, her own name gradually faded from the center of that gossip, replaced instead by growing curiosity about the maid who had somehow captured a duke's heart against every expectation society had placed upon them both. The wedding took place on a clear winter morning, the frost silvering the grounds of Vane Manor in a manner that struck Eliza as strangely fitting, given how cold and unwelcoming those same grounds had felt on the day of her arrival months earlier. The chapel filled with a mixture of guests, some who had come out of genuine goodwill, others out of simple curiosity to witness a match that continued to defy every convention of their world. Eliza wore a simple gown of pale blue, refusing the elaborate silks and jewels that had been offered to her, insisting instead on something that felt true to who she still was beneath the title she was about to claim. As she walked down the narrow aisle toward the man waiting for her, his gray eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide, she thought of every moment that had brought her to this point, the shattered porcelain, the punishing chores, the public humiliation nearly inflicted upon her, the threat against her family, and the quiet, unwavering loyalty that had met each danger with unshakable resolve. She had arrived at Vane Manor as a frightened, desperate young woman, willing to accept whatever treatment was handed to her simply to survive. She left that same chapel as a duchess, having discovered along the way that survival and dignity were never truly opposites, that a person could hold both fear and courage within the same trembling heart, and still choose, again and again, to stand firm against those who sought to diminish her. The Duke took her hands as the ceremony concluded, his smile carrying none of the cold reserve that had once defined him to everyone who knew him. "You once told me you were tired of being neither brave nor foolish," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I find myself endlessly grateful that you chose bravery." "I find myself grateful you chose to notice," she replied, and as their laughter mingled together beneath the winter sunlight streaming through the chapel windows, every trace of the cold, unyielding world that had once defined Vane Manor seemed, for that single perfect moment, to melt entirely away. The celebration that followed filled the great hall with warmth long absent from its walls, tables laden with food and wine, musicians filling the air with lively melodies that drew even the most reserved guests onto the floor to dance. Eliza moved through the gathering on her husband's arm, greeting guests she had once served tea to only months before, watching their expressions shift from cautious curiosity to something warmer as the evening progressed, and her genuine kindness became impossible to mistake for mere performance. Charlotte found her during a brief lull in the festivities, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. "I still cannot quite believe it," she said, embracing her friend tightly. The maid who broke a porcelain figure on her very first day, now mistress of the entire estate. "I could not have survived any of it without your friendship," Eliza said, squeezing Charlotte's hands warmly. "You will always have a place here, Charlotte, for as long as you wish it." "I intend to hold you to that promise," Charlotte said, laughing through her tears, "though I suspect you shall have far grander concerns to occupy your attention in the years ahead than keeping promises to an old friend from the linen room." "Never," Eliza said firmly. "Whatever title I now carry, I have not forgotten where I came from, nor do I intend to." Mrs. Prentice approached later in the evening, her usual stern composure softened considerably by the warmth of the occasion and, Eliza suspected, more than one glass of wine offered in celebration. "I confess," the older woman said, studying Eliza with an expression that mixed pride and quiet astonishment, "when you first arrived at this house, I gave you perhaps a week before Lady Constance or His Grace's temper drove you away entirely. I have rarely been so pleased to find myself mistaken." "You gave me far more guidance than you likely realize, Mrs. Prentice," Eliza said. "I am grateful for every lesson, even the difficult ones." "See that you remember them," Mrs. Prentice said, though her tone had lost every trace of its former sharpness, replaced instead by something almost maternal. "A duchess who forgets the value of hard work and quiet dignity is no duchess worth serving." I do not believe you shall ever be in danger of that particular failing. As the evening wore on and the guests began their slow departure back toward their own estates, Eliza found herself standing once more in the long gallery, this time with her husband beside her rather than a shattered porcelain figure at her feet. The portraits of his ancestors looked down upon them both, generations of vain dukes and their carefully chosen brides, none of whom, Eliza suspected, had ever entered this family through quite so unconventional a path as her own. "Do you think they approve?" she asked, gesturing toward the painted faces watching from their gilded frames. "I think," the Duke said, wrapping his arm gently around her waist, "that most of them married for reasons far less honest than love, bound by contracts and alliances rather than genuine affection. I suspect more than a few of them would envy what we have found, however unconventional the path that led us here." "And your grandmother?" Eliza asked softly, "whose porcelain figure I so carelessly destroyed on my very first day. What might she have thought of all this?" A genuine warm smile spread across his face at the question. "My grandmother was a woman of remarkable spirit, far more like you than like the quiet, dutiful brides my family has favored in recent generations. I believe she would have adored you immensely, and I suspect she would have found great amusement in the fact that her cherished figurine played a role, however small, in bringing us together." Eliza laughed softly, leaning into his embrace as the last of the evening's candles flickered gently around them. "Then, perhaps its loss was not entirely a tragedy after all." "No," he agreed, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I have come to believe that some of the most important beginnings in life arrive disguised as disasters, revealing their true purpose only much later, once we have found the courage to see them through." Outside, snow had begun to fall softly over the grounds of Vane Manor, blanketing the courtyard in quiet white, transforming the cold, imposing estate that had once seemed so unwelcoming into something that finally, truly felt like home. Eliza stood in the circle of her husband's arms, watching the snow gather against the tall windows of the gallery, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel safe, to feel valued, to feel entirely and completely herself, without fear of what tomorrow might demand of her. The journey that had brought her to this moment had tested her in ways she never could have anticipated on that first frightened carriage ride toward an unfamiliar house and an intimidating master. She had faced humiliation and threats, cruelty disguised as concern for propriety, and the constant, exhausting pressure to make herself smaller in order to survive in a world that valued birth and title above honesty and courage. And through every trial, she had held fast to the one thing that truly belonged to her, a stubborn, unshakable dignity that no amount of wealth or power had ever managed to strip away. That dignity, she understood now, standing warm and safe within her husband's embrace, had been the truest gift she carried into this new life, more valuable than any title or fortune that now accompanied her name. It had won her the respect of a household that once doubted her, the loyalty of a friend who had stood beside her through every difficulty, and finally, the genuine, unwavering love of a man the entire county had once believed incapable of feeling anything beyond cold obligation. As the snow continued to fall over Vane Manor, transforming the grounds into something soft and peaceful beneath the darkening winter sky, Eliza Hartwell, now Duchess Vane, closed her eyes and allowed herself, at last, to simply be at peace. Spring arrived at Vane Manor with a gentleness the estate had rarely known in years past, the frost giving way to soft green fields and the first warm winds carrying the scent of blooming gardens through the open windows of the great house. Eliza stood in the same long gallery where her story had begun, though the space around her had transformed as thoroughly as she herself had over the preceding months. Fresh flowers filled every vase, warm light spilled through freshly cleaned windows, and the household staff moved through the corridors with an ease and cheerfulness that had been entirely absent during her first difficult days of service. Being a duchess, she had quickly discovered, brought challenges she had never anticipated during her years of humble labor. She spent long hours learning the intricate customs of the nobility, practicing the graceful manners expected of a woman in her position, and navigating social gatherings where every word and gesture was scrutinized by guests eager to find fault with a duchess who had risen from among the very servants they employed in their own households. Some of these encounters proved genuinely difficult, filled with barely concealed condescension from women who could not accept that birth alone should not determine a person's worth. But Eliza met each challenge with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through the darkest days of her early service. She refused to abandon the values that had defined her before her marriage, continuing to treat every member of the household staff with genuine warmth and respect, remembering their names and their families, ensuring that no maid or footman within Vane Manor ever endured the kind of casual cruelty she herself had once faced. Word of her kindness spread quickly among the servants of neighboring estates, and more than one household began to notice a subtle shift in how their own masters and mistresses treated those who served them, as though Eliza's quiet example had begun to ripple outward through the county in ways she had never intended, but welcomed all the same. Charlotte remained close by her side throughout this transition, no longer serving as a maid, but elevated instead to the position of Eliza's personal companion, a role that allowed their friendship to continue flourishing, even as their circumstances had grown so dramatically different from those early days folding linens together in shared exhaustion. "You have not changed at all," Charlotte observed one afternoon, as the two women walked together through the gardens that had once required Eliza's careful, laborious tending. "Everyone expected marriage would transform you into someone unrecognizable, distant and cold like so many of the other ladies in this county. Instead, you remain exactly who you always were." "I hope I have grown, at least a little," Eliza said, smiling as she paused to admire a bed of blooming roses. "Though I agree that becoming someone unrecognizable was never my intention. I fought too hard to become myself in the first place to simply abandon that person now." The Duke found them there among the roses, his expression carrying the same warmth that had become so familiar over the preceding months, a stark contrast to the cold, guarded man Eliza had first encountered in the gallery nearly a year earlier. He had changed as much as she had, perhaps more. The careful distance he had once maintained from everyone around him, gradually replaced by an openness that surprised even those who had known him his entire life. "I have received word from Lady Constance," he said, settling beside Eliza on a small garden bench. "She has become engaged to a viscount from the northern counties, a man of considerable fortune and, from what I understand, genuine kindness." "I am glad to hear it," Eliza said, and she found she meant the words entirely, without any trace of the old wariness that might once have colored such news. "I hope she finds true happiness in that match, whatever difficulties passed between us before. You are a more generous soul than most would manage, given everything she attempted against you," the Duke said, studying her with quiet admiration. "Holding on to anger accomplishes very little," Eliza said. "I would rather spend my energy building something good than nursing old wounds that have already healed." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a letter, delivered by a breathless young footman who had run the length of the garden path to deliver it, his excitement evident even before he spoke a single word. The letter came from Eliza's father, and as she read through its contents, tears of genuine joy gathered in her eyes. "He has secured a new position," she said, her voice trembling with happiness. "A respectable one, managing the affairs of a merchant house in London. He writes that our family's debts have finally been settled in full, and that my mother and brother are well and eager to visit us here at Vane Manor, now that the danger which once threatened our name has passed entirely. Then we must prepare a proper welcome for them," the Duke said, taking her hand warmly in his own. "Your family shall always have a place within these walls, Eliza, exactly as you have always had a place within my heart." The visit, when it finally occurred weeks later, brought a joy to Vane Manor that the old estate had perhaps never fully known in all its long history. Eliza's mother wept openly upon seeing the grandeur of her daughter's new home, though she wept even more freely at the warmth with which her daughter continued to treat everyone around her, servant and noble guest alike, proof that whatever fortune had bestowed upon their family, the essential goodness of Eliza's character had remained entirely untouched. Her younger brother explored the vast grounds of the estate with wide-eyed wonder, and the Duke, much to everyone's surprise, spent an entire afternoon teaching the boy to ride, patient and encouraging in a manner that revealed a warmth few outside his closest circle had ever been permitted to witness. Watching the two of them together, laughing as the boy struggled to maintain his balance atop a gentle, aging mare, Eliza felt a fullness in her heart that she had never dared to imagine possible during those first frightened days of her arrival at Vane Manor. That evening, as her family settled into the guest chambers prepared for their extended visit, Eliza and the Duke stood together once more in the long gallery, watching the sun set beyond the distant hills in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The portrait of the Duke's grandmother hung nearby, restored to its place of honor, a small replacement porcelain figure resting once more upon its familiar pedestal, a quiet reminder of everything that had unfolded since that first fateful accident. "Do you ever think of that first day?" the Duke asked, "when you stood exactly where we now stand, certain that I intended to dismiss you on the spot?" "Often," Eliza admitted, leaning gently against his shoulder. "I think of how frightened I was, how certain I felt that I had already ruined everything before my service had truly begun. I never could have imagined, standing there among the broken porcelain, that it marked the beginning of the happiest chapter of my entire life. Nor could I have imagined, he said softly, that the maid who refused to apologize for an honest mistake would become the woman who taught me everything I had never known about genuine courage, genuine dignity, and genuine love. I was a cold, guarded man before you arrived at this house, Eliza. You changed everything, simply by refusing to be anything less than exactly who you were. She turned to face him fully, her heart full of a happiness she had once believed entirely beyond her reach. And you changed everything for me as well, by seeing past the apron and the title of maid to the person underneath, when so many others would have looked straight through me without a second thought. The last light of the setting sun spilled through the tall gallery windows, bathing them both in warm golden light as they stood together, hand in hand, surrounded by generations of portraits that had witnessed centuries of duty and obligation, finally give way to something far more precious, a love built not on the expectations of birth or fortune, but on mutual respect, unwavering courage, and the simple, powerful truth that dignity belonged to every person, regardless of the station into which they happened to be born. Vane Manor, once known throughout the county as a cold and unwelcoming house, had become instead a place of warmth and quiet joy, transformed entirely by a maid who had once dared to look a duke in the eye and refused to be intimidated, and by a duke who had discovered, in that singular moment of defiance, the courage to finally become the man he had always been capable of becoming. News of their happiness traveled far beyond the borders of the county in the months that followed, carried by guests who attended the many gatherings now hosted at Vane Manor, gatherings that felt entirely different from the tense, formal affairs of the past. Where once the great hall had echoed with careful, guarded conversation and quiet judgment, it now filled regularly with genuine laughter, with music that invited even the most reserved guests to dance, with a warmth that visitors often remarked upon long after they had returned to their own estates. Eliza took particular joy in establishing a small school within the village nearest the manor, funded from her own household allowance, offering young girls from working families the chance to learn reading and simple arithmetic, skills she herself had been fortunate enough to acquire before her family's fortunes collapsed. She visited the school herself whenever her duties allowed, sitting among the children and listening to their hopes for the future with the same patient attention she had once longed for someone to offer her during the darkest days of her own uncertain circumstances. The Duke supported her efforts fully, using his own influence to ensure the school received proper funding and recognition throughout the county, and in doing so, he found himself increasingly drawn into conversations about fairness and opportunity that he had rarely considered before Eliza entered his life. Together, they became known throughout the region not merely for the unconventional nature of their marriage, but for the genuine good they brought to everyone whose life intersected with their own, whether servant, tenant, or fellow noble. On quiet evenings when the demands of estate business and social obligation finally eased, Eliza and the Duke often returned to the long gallery, their favorite place within the sprawling manor, where they would sit together near the window and speak of ordinary things, the progress of the harvest, letters from her family, small joys and small worries that filled the rhythm of their shared life. It was in these quiet, unremarkable moments, far removed from grand confrontations and public scandal, that Eliza found the truest measure of the happiness she had built. She had come to Vane Manor as a frightened stranger, carrying nothing but a single trunk and a stubborn refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control. She remained there now as its beloved mistress, having discovered along the way that the very qualities once viewed as dangerous insolence in a servant, honesty, courage, and an unshakable sense of her own worth, were in fact the very foundations upon which a truly happy life could be built, regardless of the station into which a person happened to be born. And as the years passed, and the story of the maid who defied a duke and won his heart became something of a quiet legend throughout the county, whispered with admiration rather than scandal, Eliza never forgot the lesson that first difficult day in the gallery had taught her, that dignity, once claimed and never surrendered, could not be shattered nearly so easily as porcelain.